everyone. Welcome to Howdy Partner. It's me, David Daniels, coming again. It's been a while since I've been on the show. It's a couple months, so it's good to be back. So howdy, Twitch. I've got my my coworker Mohamed with me today. So we're gonna have a fun show. Again, I'm David Daniels, Partner Solutions Architect with AWS. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Mohamed.
Sounds good. Thanks, Daniel. Sorry, David. My name is Mohamed. Partner Solutions Architect here at AWS. Been enrolled for about a year now. Our team primarily works to scale the discovery, development, and delivery of high-quality capabilities for customers with partners like SourceFuse. So super excited to see what SourceFuse has put together today. Nice little demo we have going on. So super excited to kind of dive deep into that solution and see what we have today. I'm super excited.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for joining me, Mohamed. So for those of you that don't know, Howdy Partner is our weekly Twitch series that highlights the AWS Partner Network, and we love to bring partners on and introduce you to their cool solutions and show you what they're doing, and give you some looks at what's being done with AWS services from AWS partners. And really fun, cool way to see what people are doing out there and cool things that are being built. So today we actually have a partner, SourceFuse. So we're excited to welcome Kabir and James onto the show today. They're going to teach us about SourceFuse, and let's bring them on. And Kabir and James, welcome to the stream. How are you guys doing?
Hey guys.
Welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
So Kabir, you're what time is it over there? Where are you coming to us from?
It's 3 in the morning when I'm going obviously in India. That's all right. We're excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we're excited to have you on. Thank you so much for staying up late and coming on and teaching us. So I understand that you're going to introduce SourceFuse, and go ahead and tell us about it. What are we going to learn from you guys about SourceFuse today?
Yeah. So SourceFuse is we're a 17-year-old company. We're headquartered out of Jacksonville in Florida, and we're an all-in AWS partner, right? We help medium and large enterprise both migrate and modernize on AWS. And then when we say we modernize, that means a couple of things, right? So it either means that we modernize their legacy workloads. So we work with a lot of Windows, .NET, SQL Server kind of workloads, and then migrate them over to more cloud native services. So migrating apps from .NET to .NET Core, moving Windows databases to things open source databases like Postgres and so on. But then modernization also means we help companies kind of reinvent their existing business processes and services. And to do that, sometimes you need to create net new applications, digital platforms, etc. And for that, we now leverage what we built called SourceFuse Arc, right? Now, given we've been in business for the better part of 2 decades, application development is core to what we did, and still what we do. But what we kind of saw was in a lot of these enterprise application builds and engagements, you have to kind of keep on reinventing certain wheels. So we saw that in every enterprise app we built, we had to go through the motions of creating an enterprise-grade authentication system, right? And you would have to have some sort of access control. A lot of the apps we build are healthcare and financial services apps, so compliance and regulation will need stuff like to build audit logs in place, right? So to capture who did when and what. And then during the pandemic, there was a surge in demand for remote working apps, kind of like this one, right? So there was a search for like telemedicine apps and other healthcare applications. So we built reusable assets to kind of help accelerate those kind of builds. So what we built, essentially, we started off with, uh, or what Arc started off with was a set of reusable microservices, because really all modern application development now is microservice based. So that was it was a good kind of confluence of what we needed to do, which was build an accelerator, but then also have it enforce the architecture that a modern cloud native microservices based application needs. So we built we're about 12 to 15 microservices that do everything from authentication, authorization, audit logs, chat, video calls, payment processing. We have a bootstrapped SaaS foundation, that we use to basically build the foundation for all of these client applications, right? And then we also now have a set of reusable infrastructure as code modules that James and his team has worked on, that basically help us accelerate and create, enterprise grade production environments on AWS. So we've got everything from an EKS blueprint, an ECS. We've got, we can bootstrap a serverless environment, in hours versus, days or weeks, because everything is kind of baked into those modules, right? It's all very best practice driven, and it's battle tested because we have the microservices framework, for example, working across at least 20 applications for different customers, everything from healthcare, financial services, to even large telecom companies, are running apps built on this platform. And then really what we've done is kind of industrialize the process, right? As a software services company, you see a lot of waste when you see teams kind of struggling with what you've done 20 times before. So we kind of got rid of that. So everything is now, driven through, what James will show us, which is Backstage, right? Which is a open source Spotify platform for developers. So at SourceFuse, we have our own rollout of Backstage. So it's essentially a developer platform where you can go to, and you have access to all of your repositories, your documentation, your best practices and patterns, and things like that. And then you can quickly kind of roll out either those environments or quickly kind of bootstrap an application using all of those services and hit the ground running. So what we've noticed is, anywhere between 25 and 40% of cost, effort, time is saved when we build this off this foundation versus just going through normal conventional development practices.
That's impressive. That's a lot of time saving and just a lot of saving work and repetitive processes. So I think everybody could resonate with that. That's just something that I'm really excited about. Personally, I hate doing the same thing over and over. So that's definitely something I can get behind. Anybody in the chat that has any questions, feel free to throw them out there. We love getting questions from the chat. So feel free to throw them out there and we'll try and get them answered during the show. All right, cool. So thank you, Kabir, for that explanation of what SourceFuse does. So I understand that you're going to be showing us a few things today.
Yeah.
So no, I'm sorry. Go ahead, James.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, yeah, I'll pick it up from here. So it's also late. So if Kabir wants to head out, he can. But I will start off with like a little bit of a deck. I hate doing it just so I can kind of show things a little more concisely. But in general, the biggest problem with microservices, as far as if you were to compare it to monoliths before, is just the amount of boilerplate that you have to deal with, because you're constantly having to create more processes, right? So more services, more containers, more serverless functions, whatever. So you inevitably end up with a lot of boilerplate in there. And so that's also part of the problem too with microservice adoption, is that it gets really hard to maintain those standards at scale, especially when you start looking at things across, dozens or hundreds of team members. So a big part of this too is to help reduce that, and to make it a little bit easier for people who maybe want to get into microservices but aren't as technical with all the other pieces involved, right? So there's a lot more things that have shifted left. There's a lot more pieces that that require automation kind of end to end to really be effective, right? It's really difficult to manage microservices at scale without the automation to back it up, right? A monolith, maybe you could get away with it. Hey, maybe we've got some manual steps here and there, whatever. But now if you've got that across dozens or hundreds of pipelines, that sort of thing, all these other pieces start to become more and more important that's around the service than just the service itself, right? There's a lot of times I feel like, especially early on, and not to get too much into that discussion about when you should actually use microservices, but it can be cumbersome early on, where there may be moments where your surface API is small compared to all of the automation and the other things you have to kind of spin up. So I'm going to go ahead and start kind of presenting some stuff. One sec.
Yeah, and while you're spinning that up, I apologize that I did not give a proper goodbye to Kabir.
Okay.
He dropped from the stream, but yeah, thank you, Kabir, for joining us. And if anybody has any questions, please throw them in the chat. We have James here, who's going to take the lead for the rest of the show for SourceFuse's demo and be their person to answer the questions here. So I'll go ahead and
sure,
add your screen there, and go ahead and take it away, James.
Cool. So I'm gonna kind of just go through this really quickly, and then I'm gonna start popping stuff up and actually doing some more functional stuff, because nobody wants to sit here and look at a bunch of slides. As we kind of discussed, there's kind of like three areas here: the API, which is the microservices; the UI. We have some boilerplates in Angular and React, and then the IAC is a collection of higher level modules. I'll get into more specifics about that, but the underlying principle here is that we didn't write anything from scratch in terms of, like, we didn't go write our own version of Nest or our own version of an API framework, right? Like, the APIs are built off of Loopback, which is a node framework. The UIs, obviously using React and Angular, but then in conjunction with that, on the React side, for example, we're using a handful of pretty commonly used libraries and frameworks under the hood. The IAC, again, there might be a couple of modules that we've kind of written by hand in Terraform, but a lot of it is more what I would compare to like a high order component in React, for example, where it's more the composition of smaller modules to make a more workable unit. So there's a lot of credit due to the open source community. Everything here is built off of open source, and we do try to contribute back, where we can. We're maintainers of Loopback, for example. So, there's nothing here that's necessarily in terms of we didn't invent anything. Kind of, this is more about our approach. And I'll kind of relate that to customers too, and how we kind of teach them to do this themselves. But the way to think about this is if you want to think about, abstraction in a programming sense, there's our abstract model, which that's where we're talking about the industrialization. There's another term for it that we've been tossing around called the factory model, where, you can have a team or a tool that just allows you to kind of generate huge sections of components, and then people can just tie those things together like you would on an assembly line. So it's more about, when it comes to our customers, about this is our concrete implementation of that model. But we do often run into scenarios where the customers have already started down this path, so they already have things that they want to use. Maybe they don't use Node, maybe they use a different framework, whatever. So we're not completely boxed into like forcing it on them. If anything, we just say, hey, that's great, we'll help you guys onboard that, or here's how you can take the model we developed and apply that to your specific problem domain. So on the IAC, I'll just put it to you this way: we go from control tower landing zone rollout all the way to the product platform level. So we basically do everything end to end. I'll kind of discuss some of the capabilities around there and how all this stuff ties together. But we roll out. We're one of the partners who actually are part of the landing zone acceleration program. So we roll out the LZA, which is a tool by AWS. Or we primarily roll out the AFT, but more or less our approach in general is automation first and automation kind of always. So that's where it really starts off, on the AWS journey. And then everything from there out, from then on is mostly going to be, some Terraform or some CDK for Terraform. And then the front end and back end, the back end in particular has a lot of kind of canned services that are good starting points. Like all of these pieces, if you're maybe a smaller, medium-sized business, a lot of these things, and you don't have, for example, a holistic authentication solution, this is likely going to handle most of your needs out of the box. For larger enterprises, this is more suited for acceleration. So it's a good way to get from point A to point B faster, but it's not necessarily, the end-to-end solution, just because the complexity there, it would be really difficult for us to handle every single edge case. And in this scenario, to use auth, for example, we integrate with OpenID Connect, right? So as long as you've got an OpenID Connect provider for your SSO or something like that, we can support that downstream. So, we're not in the business of building key cloaks and cognitos, right? But, we'll just use Cognito in that case, right? So, but everything, integrates over some sort of kind of industry accepted protocol, and it's all meant to be open source, right? There shouldn't be anything proprietary in there. So yeah, I kind of just went over this kind of stuff to you, but essentially, we'll go from the longest part of actually deploying stuff. It takes longer to roll out the control tower landing zone than it actually does our application stack, just because you have to sit there and wait for a few hours. So within a couple of days of having a commercial account created, we can have production environments running with apps deployed into them. That's kind of really the main goal there. Kind of keep going through some of this stuff. All right, so I'm just going to start getting into the demo because this is boring. Does anybody have any questions so far before I start really getting into the weeds?
Yeah, feel free to throw some questions up in the chat. Anybody that's got questions, we're happy to ask them. Happy to have James here and use him as a resource to ask whatever questions we've got. So,
I have a quick question for you, James.
Sure.
So you mentioned those 3 key features in the slide. Is that what differentiates you guys from similar frameworks out there in the industry today? Or just
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question. I would say that the differentiator here is just one, it's the open source thing. I mean, there's not a ton of people who are gonna give away the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. As far as like all the pieces that are involved. But then the other aspect of this too, though, is those microservices are deployed at very large enterprise customers with very high demands. So they're very, very battle tested, and we have run those not just in AWS, they're running on-prem, Google, Azure, kind of everywhere too, right? So that would be kind of the area where I would say there's a big key differentiator. But the bigger kind of piece of it too is it's a model for how to do something as much as it is like that in product, right? So there's that kind of flip side of it too, is there's that as a service provider, right? We aren't necessarily selling this as a white label thing. This is more part of like a white glove approach. So this is more meant to be we have everything that you would need to kind of get up and running very quickly. But the goal of that is it's not the acceleration in of itself. It's the ability to get immediately to feature development, right? Like at the end of the day, as a product shop, where we want to be, what we want to do and what we want to provide are, features to end users one way or the other. Obviously, with things that are a little bit more technical, like, back-end stuff for landing zones, it's not always, tangible from the end user, but the goal is to not, is to have something that's completely baked kind of end to end. So for example, if we want to bring up, I'll just start with kind of like the landing zone, count baselines, that sort of stuff. This is just a kind of raw example of just a generic kind of AWS, multi-account structure with a landing zone with control tower, right? So what we are able to do, right, is through this kind of setup, if they're HIPAA compliant, for example, right, we will probably actually use the landing zone accelerator for that. But the goal is from the beginning, we're handling things like security and compliance out of the box, right? So we immediately deploy something that's has the capability of achieving that compliance. When it comes to, on the infrastructure as code side, there are going to be sensible defaults and or maybe some things you can't turn off. For encryption's always on, those sort of things, so that there is a little bit of a narrow vision as far as all of the capabilities end to end it'll support, because we don't often operate in areas that don't have compliance needs, right? So I guess that would probably be another big differentiator too, is a lot of this is being deployed in HIPAA compliant areas. There's some stuff that's in GovCloud, for example, some things that are touching PCI, that sort of thing, that we usually operate, especially in the health and life sciences sector there. So a lot of what we've been working towards is making sure that things like HIPAA compliance or SOC 2 compliance are easy and kind of built in out of the box. So typically, I'll just kind of take us through like the kind of journey that, like, let's say this is brand new customer, you're new to AWS. Like, let's just say it's a map, right? It's part of the migration acceleration program. You've got 500 servers on-prem, and you've got some old SQL Server stuff, and you want to, we're going to do the migration, but we've got a tight deadline, and we've got to modernize some pieces of it because, let's say there's some end-of-life stuff going on, or, the typical kind of things you have to deal with in migration, right? Not everything just like lifts and shifts out of the box. The first step is the thing that you're seeing here. We'll actually go into our tool called Backstage, which I'll pull up right now. This is a sanitized version, so there's nothing running in here that's client facing. But we'll come in here, and through some of the things that we have set up, some of these templates and that sort of thing, we can go ahead and start. I'm not going to go through some of these because they have a lot of input parameters, but let's say you are going to start off with some sort of, you're going to provision the landing zone, and then subsequently we need to deploy some things to a workload account. So just so I can plug AWS, I'll go ahead and pull up the landing zone accelerator while I'm at it. If you aren't familiar with this, compared to a lot of the other solutions, hand rolling it yourself, that sort of thing, the LZA is significantly more robust than pretty much all of the previous iterations of it. And it ships with best practice. It ships with best practices baked into it and different kind of configurations. So they have a best practice, which is the baseline for everything. But then there's a HIPAA version, there's a PCI version, there's some government variations, that sort of thing. So that's typically the first thing that we'll do. And we'll even generate or scaffold the config files out of that through a tool like Backstage. Once this stuff is deployed, typically the next step is going to be, we're going to deploy some sort of mono repo as a starting point for the actual infrastructure itself. So if you kind of look here, there's a bunch of these parameters. I'm going to skip through filling out the whole form, but just to call out some stuff, if you can see here, there are things like the, Dynamo lock table and the bucket. So if you're familiar with Terraform, these are prerequisites to these. This is where your remote state gets shared. Your environment name, a namespace, some Route 53 zones, right? Like there's kind of a handful of these parameters we'll fill out. What that ends up outputting is an actual repository with all of the Terraform loaded for you to get up and running. So I will pull up our, excuse me.
Speaking of Terraform, we have a question in the chat from Young.
Sure.
Asking, right, if SourceFuse has any kind of, prescriptive guidance for customers, who don't have or have zero experience in building an application. So if they have no experience with any tools.
Yeah, so that would be do you mean as far as building out the microservices from scratch, or just general prescriptive guidance?
Yeah, I think the question is just, do you have prescriptive guidance for customers with zero experience in building a platform? Like if you have no experience with the tools.
Sure. Well, my prescriptive guidance would be to hire us first and foremost. That's the prescription right there. But yes. So back up a little bit on that one. We don't have all that published right now. So the things that I'm showing you guys right now, we have published open source repositories and things like that. We need to wrap up some of the implementation guides and some of the documentation around it. So it's a yes and no on that. Yes, we have the capability and the foundation. No, in that we need to publish some more documentation and guidance around it, but it's all there, right? So for example, what I'm showing you guys right now, where it's not going to make a lot of sense, it's just a bunch of folders, but this is, for example, what actually outputs from this template right here that I'm showing is a repository. The inside of here has a bunch of these like packaged up pieces that you'll need to actually deploy something in AWS. So in this case, this output, right, the database, bootstrapping the AWS environment if you need to actually deploy the initial pieces to run Terraform, ECR, ECS. If you need ECS or EKS, it'll be in there. You can pull out what you don't need. Elasticache. We've packaged it up with some GitHub runners, some IAM stuff for admins, and some other, WAF, all those kinds of things, with the idea being that once you scaffold this piece and literally with a script, all this stuff will just deploy on your own and it's up and running, right? So that's a little bit oversimplification because of all the parameters involved, but that's ultimately where we wanted to get, was to have something baked in and very easy so somebody can just pull with some sensible defaults and get up and running. I'll send out some links and stuff to our to some of our docs later, but just to give you an example, that repo that I just showed you implements this most, if not all, of what's in this diagram here, and it's a little bit small, but that is the goal, right? So if you need a multi-AZ architecture to run some apps, you need some data, you need some storage, that sort of thing, the IAC will spit out all of that for you, with the idea being that you don't have to go in and reinvent this yourself. Or let's say there's a couple of modules that don't suit your needs. You can fork them. They're all open source behind the scenes too. You could submit a feature request and we'll probably knock it out for you. Or if you find out there's another module that just does more, that's better for you, you can swap it out, right? Everything is kind of built in with that approach of interchangeability. So once this thing is up and running, the next step would be on the Terraform side would be, after some Terraform is run, then we're going to want to start excuse me, wanting to maybe deploy some microservices. So in this case, I'm just kind of run through this one a little bit more because I need to get to the next stage. So at this point, you got an AWS environment running. You've got Kubernetes or ECS or Lambda, whichever one you're going to really pick. We do support things like EC2, but that's not really our primary goal. But so let's say you're at day 2 or 3 at this point, right? So now you want to stand up the basic building blocks of an app. So you want to deploy authentication. Almost every system is going to have some sort of auditing capability in it. If you want, there's a handful of these other services in here that kind of do varied things, but these are probably the two that get deployed the most. You'll select those. If I have anything custom where I want to go ahead and scaffold, so let's say I'm an e-commerce site, I know I'm going to have orders and customers and these other APIs, I can go ahead and add them to this scaffolder. If I want a facade, won't spend too much time on this. This is more of facade API type pattern where maybe this is proxying 3 APIs because you want to just merge the responses into one or something. If you need anything kind of custom installed, you're going to use Postgres because you deployed that already from the monorepo, and some stuff like that. You'll pick this thing and hit run again, just for the lack of not wanting to watch the grass grow. I'm actually going to pull up the output of that, which our team actually spun up. Let me see when the first commit on this repo was. We spun up a telemedicine app specifically for this, so I'm working my way towards it to kind of show the actual capability that's there. Let's see. So sometime less than a week ago or so, we deployed this thing and started building it. The output of that, this has been converted into a template, so the folder structure is a little weird. But the output of that, like I kind of showed earlier, was there's a service in here with authentication. In this case, because we're doing video conferencing and some chats, there's notification of video conferencing. So that thing runs, it creates this code that all gets, goes through some sort of, automation pipeline. In our case, we typically use GitHub, but our customers have used everything under the sun that you can name it. GitLab, GitHub, Azure DevOps, it's all been in use in some form or another. We typically, with what we publish, still operating GitHub, but the CI/CD pipelines and that sort of thing, there's also a lot of everybody's a little bit different on that front. So we may have some kind of recommended approaches, but there's more often than not different quality control gates and or internal approvals and that sort of thing you kind of have to work through. So we try not to get too much into prescribing those types of things as we do the other areas where it's pretty much standard. The UI, similar kind of approach. Again, just for complete transparency, even less than a week ago, so last Friday. So at this point, you've deployed these things and triggered them. They've all built and deployed. So what does it actually look like at the end of the day? Well, now there's an app running, right? So in this case, this is demoing our serverless stack. So what I showed you guys before, with the microservice generation, there's something that we haven't fully published in the backstage, but what's new is we rolled out a serverless stack that's all of our APIs will run in Lambda now. So all of them are packaged up similarly to where they're deployed with Terraform CDK and in TypeScript, to where you can basically, if you did want to run everything in Lambda, by default, it uses a more generic Docker setup. But if you did want to deploy in Lambda, you can select those options in that wizard, and then have this actually provisioned to Lambda instead of ECS or EKS. So I'm going to go ahead and log in, and there is somebody on the other end. So if Travis is listening, I hope you're logged in. So give me 1 second to pull up some creds.
And while you're doing that, we got a couple more questions in the chat. So No Foster 62 asks, what kind of ARCs do you have for data visualization and ARCs for machine learning, natural language processing?
Sure. So that's on our next roadmap. Those you just basically mentioned are two biggest roadmap items: is visualization, reporting, AI/ML. To speak to SourceFuse in general, we have an AI/ML team that has done some really great work, and one of the clients that I can't mention by name, but they don't use the public cloud at all. So not even for the thing I'm about to talk about. Every major cloud has a contract parsing machine learning tool. They did not want to use it, so we built that whole thing from the ground up. Using all of the same kind of tools behind the scenes. So we do have a very, very capable machine learning team. So we're at that point now of figuring out how to best kind of turn that into something that's a little bit more reusable. I think the starting point for that is going to be, I'm very, my background as an engineer is I've been programming, on the Microsoft stack since I was a teen, because my parents were IT and that's what they use. But I've really been a, pretty hardcore Python dev for quite a while. So I love Fast API. That's kind of like my preferred Python framework. And then, so what we've done is we've been serving ML models with Fast API. That's what we're trying to figure out next is we want to release some of the things that we've done there in a manner that makes sense. But there was another kind of component to that too, where there's some distributed work that needs to be done behind the scenes, that sort of thing. So it's more about, this is one of those scenarios where it takes a little bit of effort to kind of abstract all that to get it to a point where we can pull it out for the general community to use. But that's my, like, by the end of the year, that's one of those things I want to have kind of out in some form or another. On the visualization thing, we're still kind of looking into where exactly we're going to land there, but I will recommend personally, QuickSight's always, the AWS answer, but if you're looking for something open source, which is where we kind of live, Apache Superset is probably one of the ones I would really highly recommend if you need more of a BI intelligence kind of reporting tool. So that could be its own kind of discussion, but typically on the visualization thing where stuff gets hairy is separating like reports from stuff that goes in apps, and not all the tools maybe work the best way for one scenario over the other. But I'll give AWS another plug. Some of the stuff that they've been doing with AI and ML in QuickSight is really, really powerful. And that is something that if you are already in AWS and you haven't kind of looked into that and Redshift and that sort of thing, definitely, talk to an SA or something about it, because you're probably missing out on, a lot of capability there. So let me ping somebody, get them online. So what I'm going to do here is, so this is the UI. This is deployed in CloudFront. It's running Lambdas behind the scene. I am in as the doctor. I'm going to have somebody call me as a patient. Yep. So, and then again, all this stuff is running serverless. I believe this is the React version. With this particular app we're also partners with PubNub and Vonage. So when all this stuff kicks off here in a second, I'm just waiting for somebody to get on the other end. Excuse me. Here we go. So you're gonna see me and somebody else, right? So we spun this up basically for the purposes of this demo to show like how quickly and easily you can kind of recompose what we've got into something, an end-to-end solution. So this is Travis, one of our other architects on the other end. But kind of the bigger, yep. But the bigger.
Can he hear us?
I don't know. He's watching on the other end, so
cool.
I wasn't sure. Yeah,
stream, Travis. Everyone say hi, Travis.
So yeah, I wasn't sure if how the sound was going to work, so I didn't want to keep it on too long. But we've rolled the tool set that you see here. There are several customers of ours that have telemedicine platforms that we built recently using this same tool set. That's why we kind of picked this, as this is in our domain, one of our definitely areas of expertise. So this is one of those things that, this is our bread and butter. Your bread and butter might be something completely different, right? But it's about the ability to be able to like recompose these things and kind of make it your own, do what you need to with it, like it's your product at the end of the day. In general, so to speak more to as a partner and the general ecosystem that we see, not everyone is going to want to use Node. Not everyone's going to want to use Terraform, right? There's definitely some tool selections in here that we've made that are opinionated for various reasons. When you look at it from just an approach standpoint and you like go up a step, what have we really done as far as like what's the mechanics behind this and how we're doing this? Well, it all kind of starts with that approach of automation and reusability. So after we spun this thing up, the next thing the team did was they actually turned that telemedicine app into a template of its own. So now if I wanted to white label this and deploy it, I could, right? So it's an approach kind of thing of like, what can I do with all of the things that I have, my assets, my IP, like how can I get the most ROI on my IP? How can I reuse as much as possible? Like, and how can I scale this out across a bunch of teams? The other way I like to think of this is scaling out architecture. Like you could think maybe architecture as a service. And a lot of times I use the example as this is me scaling myself out, because as an architect, you're not always going to be there at the end implementation. And it's pretty common. It's pretty common that you run into this scenario at scale where, let's say, I do version 1, right? I stand up that first API, the next team copies it, and then the team after that copies number 2. So you keep doing that over, because it's whoever's the latest has the best version typically. This is also a method that I had started prior to my time in SourceFuse, kind of hitting this problem of how do we keep the architecture consistent across time as you're making these updates, and everything kind of came from the same source, right? So it also helps out with some of that because it makes it a little bit more streamlined as far as you don't have that. It's not necessarily the copy of the copy of the copy. It's something should always be referencing back to whatever the root kind of core template is, so that as changes go on, when the new change to the core is updated, the other teams should be able to kind of pull that in pretty quickly, keep everything up to date. And that also prevents you from having this like crazy microservice sprawl where over time, so I may have exceeded my GitHub tokens or something for today. But anyway, so when that thing pops out, it's the same kind of setup that you guys saw here. What ends up coming out is basically this exact repository that you saw there, right? So this is just kind of a contrived example, right? You wouldn't necessarily have numerous instances of the same telemedicine app at the same organization, right? But it's just more kind of how we've approached that from the standpoint of, if you're going to deploy certain things that are common. So if you're using micro front ends, it's likely you're going to have a bunch of common pieces and common services backing those up, right? So you may end up replicating part of the UI and part of the services or something like that. So it's more meant to just kind of demonstrate that approach of always feeding back into the core and always making sure that the teams downstream keep stuff up to date and that you can scale things out. The other piece of it too that we found is that it does enable teams, like let's say you want to start going down, you want to add Go or something, right? Like you've got a compelling use case for it now. You don't have some of that stuff up front. The backstage community and the community at large, somebody has already solved like a Go starting point. It's also one of those things that I think really makes it a lot easier to iterate at scale when you do have that kind of rapid, like you need to quickly spin up 14 Go services in 4 months, right? So this helps out with that churn that you're going to hit at the very beginning where, oh, we got to go and update every Docker file, right? Or like, oh, we got to go and find all the areas we call this, this thing in the middleware and swap that out, right? It definitely helps out with some of that churn too, where it may sometimes just be easier to regenerate the boilerplate and then pull in the code that's not boilerplate, right? So it's never a one size fits all kind of strategy, but the whole point is just to kind of keep accelerating and keeping the teams going. So I outside of kind of this stuff, I mean, I didn't want to spend too much time kind of going into the weeds, but if anybody wants to, let me know, because I'm more than happy to kind of dig in deep on any of the stuff. It's it's very generalized. So that's the other thing, is there may not be the depth here of like there isn't a telecom ready 10,000 transactions a second specific use case in here, right? So it's definitely not going to give you some sort of like industry specific vertical problem solved to your very, very specific solution. It's just more about the kind of like general getting everything at the org level kind of moving.
Cool. Yeah, I see a question in the chat from Rivera Mello asking about CloudFormation templates. So is it CloudFormation templates that we're using here?
It's all Terraform and CDK for Terraform. The only area where we use CloudFormation is back to the landing zone accelerator. Just there's a CloudFormation template that you use to spawn this thing. And then obviously this is AWS CDK, so behind the scenes it's transpiling. But I'll speak to the CloudFormation Terraform kind of thing. So Terraform, it's not a knock on CloudFormation. It does a lot of things in AWS that you don't get just by using Terraform, right? But Terraform isn't just for orchestrating AWS, right? Terraform is just a way to abstract over some sort of API where you need where the information behind it's more relatively static, right? So an example would be if you're going to be orchestrating Cognito, you have a finite set of resource servers, you have a finite set of APIs, that sort of thing, that if you have multiple environments, you're probably replicating those configurations across environments with just a few changes here and there. But it's not a transactional system in the same way users would be, where you're constantly adding or removing users. So Terraform is really good at managing situations like that, and there's providers for more or less everything. So OpenSearch, for example, if you use OpenSearch in AWS, there's the AWS API that actually provisions OpenSearch in AWS, and then there's actually another API inside of OpenSearch, which is the OpenSearch API itself, that you can then also administer with Terraform, right? So we picked Terraform because it gives us the widest range of those options. But there's nothing that says you can't use CloudFormation. There's nothing that says you can't pull that stuff in. Or, and to be completely honest, there are some areas where we might actually be calling a CloudFormation template through Terraform. We do the same thing with Kubernetes and Helm. So we call Helm and Kubernetes through the Terraform API, but we're still using the kind of preferred tool in the Kubernetes ecosystem. So that's kind of another thing about the approach here, is that there's some areas like that where the tooling choice was made for interoperability and being able to pick between tools, but there's no hard and fast rule about what is and isn't supported. And we have been doing some stuff with Pulumi. I would just say that Pulumi is it's compared to CloudFormation and Terraform, it's too new. For some smaller stuff, it's worked out really well. But when we try to compare it to, like, we haven't released it right now, but our EKS module, we're integrating it with, we're just testing everything now, but we've integrated it with the EKS blueprints and add-ons from the AWS IA team. So if you wanted to, so when you compare Pulumi and what we can do in that to what we get with like a Terraform module that's been output by AWS, and we have our own kind of flavor on top of it, the maturity level hasn't quite gotten there, but I would expect, at some point too, we may end up kind of venturing down that road. But on that kind of the multiple API administration thing, the other kind of theme there is when we do use AWS, it's not to say that we don't use AWS native services, but we still try to pick things that have some cloud agnostic piece to it. So for a great example, like let's just talk about Kubernetes for example, for a minute. Kubernetes has its own API, right? So you're managing the control plane, but the rest of it's still Kubernetes, right? So then when you start looking at the rest of the Kubernetes stack, well, what are the common tools around there? Prometheus, Grafana, OpenSearch, FluentBit, all that kind of stuff. We still use those tools in our stack. But depending on the scenario, we may use managed Prometheus versus deploying it into Kubernetes itself, right? Just depending on the use case, cost. There's a lot of factors that will go into that. So if you don't have a large team of cloud engineers or DevOps engineers who are intimately familiar with all the underlying pieces of configuration, the managed services make sense, right? But we're still picking things that if we did for whatever reason have to deploy them outside of AWS, or we needed them on-prem, or just we wanted something, more cloud agnostic, it's still there, but it's on AWS, right? So it's a lot of cloud native things where AWS has provided some sort of managed infrastructure for it, but you're still using that open source piece. And open telemetry is another good example of that. So we still try to use open source and open standards where possible to make sure things are things are open. But there are, like everybody else, there are also some times where SQS is great service. It's just hard to beat it, in a lot of use cases, right? Where it's also just the simplest solution. So it's not to say we don't drink the Kool-Aid here and there, but just, it's that happy balance. But, does that kind of, I guess, maybe I've kind of went way off on a tangent there, but hopefully I answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Sometimes there's some things that work best and some things that don't work best. So yeah, I think we can all identify with that.
Perfect. Let's see if we have any other questions in the chat. But we don't have any more.
Yeah, there was one question about a pricing model.
Yes.
So is there anything about pricing? I would imagine that you have maybe like you have to consult with you guys directly, or if you have any kind of
no. So it's all. I mean, the only thing that I didn't show today is that's not open source is Backstage, just because I committed the cardinal sin of changing too many things before a demo, and there's because we provisioned code for some of our customers who we basically host their code on behalf of them. There's customer names and things like that I couldn't show the production version. But there's no pricing to use it. You can just go to GitHub, download it. I would say on that front is if you run into an issue, yeah, they're all open source, but if you run into an issue of like something doesn't work, we have a Slack channel for or actually that's a loopback one, but anyway, we GitHub issues, the typical open source community methods. You can raise issues there if you do run into something, like you pull something and you get a bug. But if it's something like, hey, we want to know how to do X, Y, and Z, and it's not something I've already published as a reference architecture or some sort of playbook or something like that, then we might have to talk about some of that. But in general, it would be more of like the way I always kind of to think about it is like, these are all the tools that we use, but like we're still the secret sauce when it comes to SourceFuse, right? Like we are still the ones who make the thing happen. We're the ones who build it, deploy it. Like that's where the magic is. Like these tools are great. They really help you out, but we still have our expertise, right? But so that doesn't stop anybody else though from using this. So there's no licensing. I think most of it's either MIT or Apache. I would say there's some other stuff out there that some SaaS stuff that does something similar that I encourage people to go and A/B it and see what works best, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's going to solve every single problem, but I would be surprised that, especially in some of the scenarios I discussed where maybe you're earlier on in the product development, or maybe you're modernizing a large ecosystem where you do have to just start from scratch to get up and running, be hard pressed to find something that does as much as what this can do, especially when it comes to the AWS side.
So for anybody just joining us, just real quick, wanted to welcome you in to AWS Howdy Partner. It's our weekly series on Twitch. we bring AWS partners in and show off their solutions and let them talk to you and kind of get them to teach us about what they're doing. Right now, today we have James Crowley with SourceFuse, and he's kind of showing us Arc by SourceFuse. So, James, thanks for going through that demo. That was really insightful and cool. I like seeing how we can make things easier. I'm a big fan of easier anything. I'm kind of lazy in that regard. I remember when I was going through a lot of coding and stuff, my instructor always told me, it's good for programmers to be lazy because we don't want to repeat ourselves. So that's principles that I always kind of kept repeating. It was the first time in my life that I'd ever heard of laziness being a good thing. So.
Yeah, well, I also was told a long time ago, if you're working as much as you are, you're doing something wrong, right? So like you got to be thinking of ways to constantly innovate, constantly make things faster, easier to use, that sort of thing, and that's what this is all about. And in particular, I've been doing that same person, had their own kind of hand-rolled. This is a while back, but hand-rolled code generator for ASP.NET Web Forms that would look at you design the database, and then it would spit out a bunch of store procedures, the DAL and ADO.NET, your good old business logic layer, and you could in the presentation layer and web forms on top of that. And it was amazing to me at the time. I was very, very green at how much that changed my ability to deliver at that, the skill set that I had at the time, because so much of it was baked into the generator. And because, especially since it was database first, right, the architect can, this is peak days of the monolith for sure, but if you got a 200 or 300 table database, there's probably a team of DBAs and architects and that sort of thing who worked on that, who spent a lot of time making it third normal form, who invested a lot of time in figuring out the indexes and all this other stuff, right? Because the database needs to run high performance because it's hard to vertically scale them, right? So all the dev resources that mattered or that had the expertise were going towards that and not towards necessarily the user interface, the actual application itself. So by having a tool like that, it enabled the junior devs who probably didn't know as much as they needed to know to get up and running to get a foundation that they can go in where they're just worrying about, oh, hey, I need to align the form fields. I need to make sure there's this little bit of presentation logic I need to handle, but all of the CRUD, is taken care of. Everything talks to each other out of the box, and that's always stayed with me because you don't want to have to have a team of architects to have to deliver a product, right? Like you want to be able to make it easier for people to use and make it so that people don't also have to know every single layer of the stack all the time. That's another thing that I run into, especially with AWS. It can be very overwhelming, the number of services, and then just the number of things that overlap can be overwhelming. And then even when you start going down the road on some of these, there's a significant amount of configuration parameters that can be applied that it does help to have something that's already kind of pre-baked, that even if you don't necessarily want to use the defaults out of it, at least you don't need to go through and become an expert to figure out, oh, I need to go and read the docs. And if I change these two things, then that enables, the use of CMKs, right? Versus the AWS managed keys, right? That's a really common one we run into is customer managed keys because of the way the KMS key policies work. It's, it can be very tedious, right? To get everything working end to end when you do have to implement that. Or let's say you also need envelope encryption, right? So it makes it a lot easier if there's a Boolean somewhere up in the stack that just says like enable envelope encryption or whatever, or enable CMKs, and you pass in the policies and everything kind of works, versus having to force somebody to go in and wire that up everywhere they need to go and do it in, right? So that's part of the approach too, is to distill down to the needful of what people need to worry about and kind of cut out a bunch of the noise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can all speak to how overwhelming it can be with over 200 plus services, right? Like it's a lot. And to expect anybody to like know all of it, like that's just
exactly. Well, I mean, even just looking at message brokers, right? SQS, there's the managed MQ variants with ActiveMQ, RabbitMQ. Even though Kafka is not a message broker, it gets treated like one. Then there's Kafka, right? Like, I mean, so you have 4 or 5 options right there that can more or less do the same thing. That even just like, how do I do messaging, right? Becomes a more complicated question than it needs to be when like your end users don't care at the end of the day. That's the other thing I like to point out is like, they want to see finished product that works. So the thing that I didn't really even get into here that's, beyond what we discussed is, after these things would go would be up and running, right? Provision. The very next thing we'd be working on is there's already integration tests and end-to-end tests that ship with this, is it's also immediately shoring up all the testing automation involved with it. It's the full SDLC, right? So it's making sure that we can get to that point and get to the point of business value add and something that an end user can use, because end users really, they will never care what the database is. They will care if it's a software company, right? But if you're building the kind of apps that we build, they just, some of them won't even know what you're talking about either, right? These are all just it's all jargon to them. It's more about kind of enabling that delivery at the end of the day than it is being obsessed with the nuances of the tech behind the scenes, right? I mean, as engineers, we love to get into that, but like nobody on the end user side is gonna want to sit here and have a discussion about why Kafka isn't a message broker, right? So yep, another one good. The data stack, that's another area where there's a lot of options there. That one comes up very frequently about how do we do data lakes, how do we do data warehousing, what are the options there? The big ECS, Lambda, EKS, right? I mean, there's 3 very, very compelling options that have a lot of nuance into picking them. And kind of my thing is like, I'm less opinionated about it. It's more to me about like, I want things to work. I want there to be tests, I want there to be automation, and I want the ability to swap things out if I need to, right? I don't want to have to get encumbered with, we spent all this time writing this code. I don't want to throw it away because we find out it doesn't work or we need to move services. If somebody says, hey, we need to move an AWS service, I say, great, let's do it, right? Like I'll swap the stuff out we need to swap out. There's probably some DI in the apps. We'll inject a different implementation. We'll swap out some Terraform. We'll brownfield the IAC so that, we run the stuff side by side so there's no downtime, and we'll just switch it, right? So I don't want the technology to be a hindrance to product delivery at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's part of being able to, innovate quickly and just try new things, keep going. I think that's a big thing of ours around here. Question that popped up in the chat about the front end. How much control, would somebody have over the front end, and how would they be able to go about changing?
So both of them are using a variation of Material UI. So they both are themed essentially. So you just basically re-implement the theme. Is probably the shortest answer I could give you. That's typically how it's done. I mean, it's back to like there's so many ways to do some of that stuff on the front end now, but that's probably the simplest and shortest answer. Is it's all through a theme. Just re-implement the theme, and it should come through. If you don't like Material UI, then that's a different problem, because that goes back to what I kind of initially said of we've made some choices about the technologies used that may, if they don't fit, if for whatever reason you have some major aversion to that particular UI library, you can fork it and pull it out if you wanted to. It's not the end of the world, but that's also why we pick some of those things so we can make sure that if you did want to retheme it or something like that, we can do it easily.
Yeah, one thing I want to kind of bring up is security. As you know, security is job zero here at AWS. All these applications that you're building for customers, how do you ensure that all these applications are secure? And if you share some best practices.
Sure. So we can go. We go to the start of the CI/CD pipeline. Everything is scanned with Sneak and Sonar. So that's going to handle like the static code analysis and the package dependencies. And on the IAC is also scanned by Sneak. The IAC in conjunction with that. So we have a kind of an environment that we build the IAC and test it in. That's actually running a combination of Security Hub and Sneak Cloud, which is a new tool they have that's very similar to Trend Micro, and it does the same kind of detection controls that you get elsewhere. So guard duty, that sort of stuff. So we have an environment where these things are getting deployed with production-like settings, and then have these things run against it, so you can actually see if we have an IAM policy misconfiguration or something like that. And then long term, the vision there is, through some of these tools, we're also going to be working on releasing some sort of like certification type thing. It's the best way I could describe it, of some sort of validation that says this is HIPAA compliant, this is SOC 2 compliant, this is PCI compliant. Sometimes that requires that things are implemented a certain way. So that's kind of the challenge right now, is spinning up reference architectures for things like HIPAA compliance. So that would start with the LZA, right? We would deploy the healthcare version of that, and then we have our own variation of the configuration there, which kind of reminds me I have probably some PRs I need to raise on that front. But we have some again battle tested configurations that we'll use for that. So by the time you get something deployed, it's already been statically scanned, and there's been some sort of something running against an environment with it running before it even hits your environment, right? Once it does go into your environment, if you want to talk about the AWS standpoint, that's where it's really mission critical these days. I don't think people really appreciate what Control Tower and Landing Zone does for you from that standpoint. It's very important that you have the consolidated security set up through that. You've got it all centralized on that end, but AWS has released guard duty, and there's been a lot of really good changes there. So that's kind of more the generalized piece of it. But once you get into things like Kubernetes, for example, or ECS or whatever, there's different runtime security tools that you'll see. So that's, again, going to be somewhat dependent on maybe the tooling or the platform, especially if you're looking outside of AWS. But AWS, the simple short answer there is like guard duty, detective, all the stuff that's already there, in addition to whatever you're doing, in your kind of DevSecOps pipelines. On the actual implementations, this is something too where you might be able to toggle encryption in some areas, you may not. I mean, we typically turn that, like, everything's encrypted by default at rest. Transit level just depends on the service and the project, but that's also a pretty typical requirement, is that you've got end-to-end TLS, those sort of things. Depending on the sector we're in, that there may also be some things in there where things are envelope encrypted on disk in addition to disk level encryption. So there's some of those things are baked in, and then some of those things are more documented of this is how you would do it for HIPAA, for example, right? They're different. A lot of that too has to do with the networking structure, but there's a little bit of nuance between some of them as far as what actually needs to be implemented. But in general, it's going to be it'll be well architected, CIS benchmarked, that kind of standard stuff out of the box.
Awesome. Great. That was pretty detailed.
Just wanted to let everyone know that I threw in the survey link in the chat there. If you could just click that link, take our survey, let us know what you like, what you don't like, what you want to see more of. We love getting that feedback. So if you could do us a favor and take that survey, appreciate it.
Last kind of thing I want to bring up here real quick. This is kind of really important to me as well, since I've been able to interact with a lot of partners and customers. How does SourceFuse help customers kind of save costs on AWS, right? What's the strategy there in terms of, because we don't want a lot of customers kind of going into using these services, working on all these charges on AWS.
Yeah.
What's kind of like the game plan there?
Yeah. So, again, I'll talk about control tower and landing zone. Make sure your billing stuff is set up there, and make sure you have cloud watch alarms and all that good stuff set up on billing. But if you want to look at the general, kind of approach there, so as a partner who's also has a migration competency, which means we're map eligible, right? That's going to start off with an optimization licensing assessment, right? The OLA. So let's just use an example of a migration. That'll be the first thing you do, right? Right size the current infrastructure, get into AWS, and then from there you're going to be using all the typical modernization tool strategies, right? Like where can we reduce licensing costs through, either migrating to an AWS service that's backed by open source or just some sort of open source variant. Yeah. And then you have your typical kind of proactive scheduling where it makes sense. So, if you have resources that, especially in lower environments, you can use something like Cloud Custodian to run schedules that will like turn things off over the weekends. That's a simple one. But when you start talking about production, like let's say the system is, you've done all the licensing optimization, you've done all the kind of simple stuff. That then goes back to load testing, making sure that things like auto scaling groups are configured correctly so that you're not expending resources when you don't need to. And then it's also going to start looking at, how the app is actually built and the services it's using and that sort of stuff. But typically with the customers we see, especially coming, doing a lot of Microsoft modernization, once you take care of licensing, auto scaling, and maybe you've kind of you've containerized it or something like that, so you've got a little bit overall resource footprint, that typically does the job as far as getting the costs under control, in a kind of a general standpoint. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, it would be more of a case-by-case thing after we kind of get through those general things, but that's the typical AWS playbook for sure. Making sure, and then the other, making sure you've got all your monitoring in place as far as budgets and that sort of stuff. So that's why I keep plugging like the landing zone accelerator, is because all that stuff is built in there as far as the billing dashboards and all that other, like all those other kind of proactive measures that if you're gonna be net new to AWS, it's just really hard to like beat all the stuff that it has out of the box. It's not to say you can't do it all on your own, but it's got a lot of those things. That foundation is there, so it makes it a lot easier if you've deployed that first to then handle these other things downstream. Not to say you can't do it, but I'm also a big fan of Cloud Custodian because we had one job who I had one company who we called it the Reaper, where if you didn't tag things, it would just, so if you tried to spin up an RDS instance and you didn't tag it, the delete command was issued before it even finished provisioning, right? Wow. So there, if you really want to get, because the tags were really important for cost analysis at scale, right? The team, the budgets and all that stuff is really driven by tags. So if people aren't deploying infrastructure with the tagging conventions, like it's just nuked. So that's another one. It's kind of brutal. The devs will complain about it for sure. But the whole point is, if you can make it out of the dev environment with something like that turned on, you'll be good to go in production.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, and one thing that I did want to mention is that the landing zone accelerator, I found it on AWS Marketplace along with a number of other solutions from SourceFuse. So that's really cool. Definitely check that out. If you wanted anything like that they have to offer as far as the landing zone accelerator, you can find that on AWS Marketplace. So there's a listing there.
Yeah, and we're working on some other listings too. So there's gonna be some more app mod stuff coming soon. We will be getting the SDP for Control Tower. We have all the, I just need to collect the evidence and do the paperwork. So that'll be coming pretty soon. And then there's some discussions too about getting Arc in the marketplace and that sort of thing. So we're definitely going to be adding more and more of those things there over the next few months. this API gateway. We've got a couple other SDPs that we're eligible for. It's just a bandwidth thing of getting those out the door and getting everything through on the AWS side. So as more of those come online, we'll also be seeing more things on the marketplace.
Yeah, that's awesome. I look forward to seeing them there. That's one thing that we love seeing is our marketplace listings and seeing partners get new listings.
Yeah, on the tagging thing, like we have a module that all it does is take some input tags and merges them with some standard tags, and then everything below that is supposed to use those tags so that there's never anything that's not tagged, right? It's so true. It's too easy not to do, and it's really frustrating when it's not done, right? Because there are some resources that the name comes from the name tag. So if you don't tag it, it's just like an ID. Like, how am I supposed to know what this is for, right? It definitely is it's a hard requirement on my end.
Awesome.
Cool. Well, James, I had a question for you. Just this one kind of focuses more on your experience with kind of building on AWS and SourceFuse being an AWS partner. Is there anything that you can say that you have just experienced being able to build better with AWS and what the benefits of that partnership have been? Like, if you could just do that for a minute.
Where do I start? So I'll just use a good example. I worked at a company that does like big data ag tech stuff. And I just remember, when we built the high performance computing cluster and we deployed Hadoop, and then we deployed Postgres on bare metal and all this stuff, and then to get it to scale, I mean, it's just, especially in the big data ecosystem, it's very, very difficult to get something that performs well at scale, just kind of on your own, just reading through docs, right? I mean, this is also 7 years ago, so the ecosystem was a lot less mature then as well. That was part of it. But I've also was a .NET Core user when it was still in beta, because the second they were like, let's go to Linux, I was like, thank you, because I work on Ubuntu and have for a long time. So it's those kinds of things and scaling those tools up. Like Aurora has just been a complete game changer in my opinion, because of the way that the disk replication works. Like, there's no IO across the network, which for Postgres, and the way write-ahead logging works, it just makes it so much easier to scale that up. Let's leave out the cost part of it for a second. But when you start looking at scaling that up to where, and I'm not necessarily talking about hyperscale, but when you're maybe between, something that's in a small or medium or large, we're talking, a couple XLs, scale. It's so much easier. Failing over and all that good stuff. It's night and day compared to having to do that on your own, whether it's on bare metal or kind of deploy that from scratch. And we support some very large Postgres deployments on-prem. There's a lot that goes into it. It's non-trivial. So that's definitely been one of the ones that's been really kind of transformative to me, because I think, especially as the DBA profession has kind of become more and more narrow, 15 years ago, that was not to say it's not a defined role now, but you needed somebody who all they did was we used to call them almost like a data center DBA type thing, where it's like, that's the person who knows how to set up cross DC replication, who knows how to set up, all of the hardware and all the software to get all this stuff running, that I don't have to worry about any of that now. So it's not to say that those jobs aren't important, but you don't need as many specialists to kind of get up and running, as you used to. And that has empowered the dev teams a lot more. So my philosophy too, in general, is that the dev team should not be completely, they should know what infrastructure they're running on. They should have some input into it. I'm not suggesting that an app dev team is responsible for the network, but I surely believe that they're responsible for their service. And if it's running in Lambda or Kubernetes or ECS, that team is more than likely also going to be writing the IAC to at least deploy, their piece of code, right? It's the same kind of thing now with, the databases and everything else, is that because you don't need as much specialization, the dev teams can own a lot more than they used to. And I think it makes for a higher quality product end to end, because those people know a lot more. It's no longer throwing it over the fence because like, oh, that's a DBA problem, right? Or that's an infrastructure problem. It's the dev team can more or less do most of it themselves, up until they get to a point to where, they need to, either the complexity gets high enough that you got to start splitting up, things around some more specialties, or, the app grows or whatever. But like I think there's a lot more ownership, and things have shifted to the left a lot more, and that's probably another big piece of it, is that there have been plenty of scenarios where I've had like 1 or 2 DevOps cloud engineers for like 30 devs. So if you want to ship your code, you better learn how to deploy things in AWS, right? So all of those things are, it's, now I kind of look back on it, it's crazy. Like there was a point where I used to remote into 40, 50 servers, like copy paste a zip file over, right? Like that was how, and I'd manually pull the app out of the server out of, from behind the load balancer, so I could deploy that code and test it and then put it back into the pool and all this crazy stuff. Like it's especially the cloud in general, right? I mean, it's come a long way, but I started off my career kind of when Rackspace and AWS were going head to head, around the early 2010s. And even from then to now, I mean, it was very game changing, the cloud in general then, but you compare what I just described to now, the idea that I don't even remote into servers anymore, right? Let's just start there. It's very rare that when it comes to a full blown, production grade situation, I'm almost never actually quote unquote I'm remoting into a server. There's no SSH, right? If you're using Aurora and you're using an ECS or EKS, you gotta, there is no like get onto the server and pull the log file kind of thing anymore, right? So things have just like really changed on that front too. But yeah, and then like the big data stack is pretty obvious. Yeah. So, and then I've also been doing been rolling OpenID stuff for a long time. So when Identity Server 2 was out was when I kind of got involved with that stuff. Having managed services like Cognito that's just like integrated with everything else, it just makes it so much easier to handle all those checkboxes that you need. Like I need my application security, right? I need my infrastructure security. Like all those things are really baked into what AWS has to offer. So it doesn't make me, I no longer have to worry about like, oh, how am I going to solve all these problems? It's just more of like, it's back to that 200 services thing. It's like, how do I stitch together the services that I know will work to do the thing that I need them to do?
And that's what we're here for. We're all that. Yeah. Feel free to reach out to us anytime when you want questions on that. That's what we're here for. Exactly. That's awesome. Just hearing about how much easier things are, and I can agree to that. Like even when I first started, I'm late to the game, but I've seen it just come along and become easier, like so much, just over the past couple of years that I've been in it. So, like Aurora is amazing. I started off with just MySQL stuff, doing working with like MySQL Workbench database stuff, and working with Aurora is just wow, like
game changer.
The amount of ease and simplicity involved and just all the extra added features is awesome. And hearing others talk about how like you built such a cool thing and how much easier it is with the use of these services. Yeah, and it's just one of those things too. I just really hope I never have to set up PG replication stuff again. Definitely not. The other big thing too is this is more just generalized, but the advent of IAC and how good it's gotten, right? That has also really changed things in that I think that was also a big barrier in why DevOps came about, right? Was that, devs oftentimes don't want to sit here and write a bunch of shell scripts and
all that other stuff, right? And then you had tools like Ansible come along that helped out, but it still was very like, still felt very more like server admin, right? Things like Terraform and now with CDK, right? It's even more into the devs ball that like if you're already a full-blown app developer, learning HCL or learning CloudFormation or learning CDK is trivial, right? You already know a full-blown programming language. So once I kind of like that got clued into that, when I first started with AWS, I'm going to be completely transparent. I didn't use the console at all. I almost exclusively learned AWS through the lens of Terraform. And almost did not know how to like do stuff in the console. It wasn't that I had some aversion to it. It's just I was under the gun. I needed to get stuff done. I figured out how to use Terraform, and I was like, oh, cool. You know, this is everything I need to get up and running. I just got so into it so fast that I kind of never looked back. And then there's still times now where I have to Google things. I'm like, how do I do this again? Just because it's as soon as I figured out I could orchestrate the cloud with code, it was like, oh, this is game over. Like there's never anything that I can't build now, because I will never need somebody else to help me provision and configure it.
Mohamed, I think did you getting ready to say something?
No.
Sorry. I thought I cut you off.
No, you're good. You're good. I was gonna say something, but you covered it the last 2 minutes, so all good there.
Awesome. Well, are there any more? I don't see any more questions in the chat. I really appreciate you joining us today, James, and just kind of going over SourceFuse and all the stuff that you guys have to offer. Really cool stuff. So yeah, just everybody out there, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for coming. Be sure to tune in again next week, Wednesday, 2 o'clock Pacific time. Should be a fun show. I believe Rancher Governance Solutions is going to be our partner next week. So be sure to tune in. I'll see you next time I see you. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Have a good one, folks. That was a great show.